The desert did not care that Mara Cole was pregnant, did not care that her boots were split, open at the toes, or that the smallest of her children whimpered. With every step, his lips cracked and bleeding from thirst. The desert only stretched, mile after merciless mile, its sand pale as bone beneath a sun that felt close enough to touch. Mara pulled the rope of the broken wagon with both hands, her shoulders burning, her belly tight and heavy beneath her torn dress, every step sending a dull ache through her spine. Behind her stumbled her 5 children in a crooked line. Eli, barely 12 but already carrying the look of a grown man's worry. Ruth clutching the hem of Mara's skirt. Twins Jonah and Luke silent now where they had cried hours ago. And little Annie, whose head lolled against Eli's side as he half carried her forward. The wind carried no mercy, only grit that stung their eyes and filled their mouths. Mara did not stop. She couldn't. Stopping meant sitting, and sitting meant never standing again.
She had buried her husband 2 weeks ago beneath a crooked cross of wagon wood.
His blood dark in the sand where bandits had left him. She had buried her grief with him, packed it down deep. Because grief did not feed children and did not lead them to water, every step she took was a promise she whispered over and over in her mind. Not today, not today. She would not let the desert take them. She would not let her unborn child die before its first breath. Even when her vision blurred and the horizon shimmered like a cruel lie, Mara kept walking. By midday, the wagon finally gave up. One wheel cracked clean through with a sound like a gunshot, sending the few remaining supplies tumbling into the sand. Mara dropped to her knees beside it, her breath tearing out of her chest, hands shaking as she stared at the ruin. There was no food left, only a half-empty canteen and a blanket stiff with sweat and dust. The children gathered close, their faces pale, their eyes too big in skull-thin faces. Eli tried to speak, tried to be brave, but his voice broke when he asked if they were going to die. Mara pulled him close, her lips brushing his hair, and lied with the tenderness of a mother who would burn the world before telling her child the truth. "No," she said. "We're just resting." But the desert listened and it waited. Vultures circled far above, black specks against the white sky. Mara forced herself up again, tearing strips from the blanket to wrap the twins' feet, tying the last canteen around her waist. When they started walking again, Annie collapsed after only a few steps. Mara lifted her, though her arms screamed in protest, and felt the baby inside her shift, a sharp reminder that time was running out. Her breath came shallow now, her thoughts blurred. And then, through the heat haze, she heard the sound, hooves, slow, steady, impossible. She lifted her head, heart hammering, afraid it was a trick of the sun. But the sound grew closer, real, and solid, until a horse emerged from the shimmering air like something torn from a dream. The cowboy reined in a few yards away, his horse dark with sweat but strong, its head high and calm. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low, dust coating his coat and boots. He did not reach for a gun. He did not speak right away. He only looked at the broken wagon, at the children swaying on their feet, at Mara standing there with a child in her arms and another life heavy inside her. His eyes were sharp but not cruel, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, as if the desert itself listened to him. "Ma'am," he said, "you won't make it another mile." Mara straightened despite the pain, pride flaring like a dying ember. "We don't need charity," she said, though her knees shook. The cowboy dismounted slowly, letting the reins fall loose. He knelt to Annie's level, offered her his canteen, then stood again and met Mara's gaze. "This ain't charity," he said. "It's survival." He glanced once at the horizon, then back at her. "There's water where I'm headed, shade, food." He paused, just long enough for the weight of her choice to settle in. Then he said the words that would change everything. "Come with me." The desert wind swept between them, carrying the scent of leather and dust and something else, hope, sharp and fragile as glass. Mara looked at her children, at their hollow faces, at the empty sky behind her. She nodded once, and with that single motion, she stepped out of death's path and into a future she could not yet imagine. Absolutely, here's Chapter 2, Part 1, continuing seamlessly in the same cinematic, emotional tone. The ride into the fading afternoon felt unreal, as if Mara had stepped out of the desert and into someone else's life. The cowboy, he finally told them. His name was Caleb Holt, set the children up with practiced ease, lifting the twins onto the saddle before him, settling Ruth behind them. and hoisting Eli up with a grip that spoke of long days and hard labor. Mara rode last, seated sideways on a thick bedroll. Annie cradled against her chest while Caleb walked the horse at a careful pace, never once complaining about the extra weight. Each step away from the broken wagon felt like a betrayal of the life Mara had lost. Yet every breath she took now came easier, cooler, as the land subtly changed. Low scrub giving way to darker soil, the air less sharp, less dry. The children clung to the horse and to one another, afraid to speak, afraid that if they did, the miracle might vanish. Caleb said little, but he watched them constantly, his gaze always moving, counting heads, measuring strength, gauging how close they were to collapse. When Annie whimpered, he slowed. When Eli swayed, he stopped entirely, insisting on rest beneath the shadow of a rock outcrop. Mara noticed everything. The way he positioned himself between them and the open land, the way his hand hovered near his gun without ever touching it, the deep lines etched into his face by more than sun and wind. This was a man who had survived things, a man who knew loss. And as the sun began to sink, painting the desert in bruised gold and red, Mara felt the strange, dangerous sensation of safety begin to creep into her bones. They reached the water just as dusk bled into night, a narrow spring tucked between rocks, surrounded by stubborn green that looked impossibly alive. The children cried out softly at the sight, voices cracking as they knelt and drank, water spilling down their chins and soaking their clothes. Caleb let them drink first, then Mara, then finally himself, standing guard while they filled their bellies and their souls. He built a fire quickly, hands sure and efficient, sparks leaping into the darkening sky like stars fighting to be born. From his saddlebags he pulled food, hardtack, dried meat, even a small pouch of beans, and when the smell reached the children, they stared at him as if he were something holy. Mara ate slowly, forcing herself to pace, though hunger clawed at her, aware of the baby shifting inside her, as if reminding her that survival was no longer just about staying alive but staying strong. When the children finally slept, curled together near the fire, Caleb sat across from Mara in the quiet, the desert humming softly around them. "You were headed west," he said, not a question. Mara nodded. "There was land promised," she replied. "A lie, maybe, but it was all we had left." Caleb stared into the fire for a long moment, jaw tight. "West is full of graves," he said quietly. "I've buried enough people chasing promises." Mara felt the weight of those words settle between them. She wanted to ask what he had lost, who he had buried, but fear held her tongue. Instead, she said the only truth she had left. "If you hadn't come," she whispered, "my children would be dead." Caleb met her gaze then, and for the first time something raw flickered in his eyes. "You kept them alive long enough for help to find you," he said. "That matters." The fire cracked. The wind shifted. And somewhere in the dark beyond the light, something watched unseen, patient, waiting for the fragile hope now burning beside the spring to falter. Here we go, Chapter 2. Part 2, tightening the tension and pushing the story toward its emotional and dangerous turning point. Mara woke before dawn to the sound of a horse snorting sharply, the fire reduced to a bed of glowing embers and the stars beginning to fade. For a moment she did not know where she was, only that the desert was no longer pressing its knee into her chest. Then she saw Caleb standing at the edge of the camp, still as stone, one hand resting lightly on the reins, the other near his gun. His posture alone told her something was wrong. The children slept on, their faces soft in the half-light, unaware of the danger threading silently through the cold air. Caleb turned his head just enough to meet her eyes and lifted one finger, not a warning of panic, but of patience. "Listen." Mara strained her ears. At first she heard nothing but wind, then the faintest sound of hooves not far off, muffled by distance and intent. Men traveled differently than... The shots came just as the sun crested the horizon, a sudden crack that shattered the quiet and sent birds screaming into the sky. Caleb moved before the echo faded, spinning and firing in one smooth motion that felt less like violence and more like inevitability. Mara dragged the children behind the rocks by the spring, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might tear free, her hands shaking as she pressed their heads down and whispered, for them not to move, not to breathe. Sand exploded where bullets struck, the air snapping with deadly force. She saw two riders break from the brush, hard men with hungry eyes, the same kind who had taken her husband and left his body cooling in the dirt. Rage surged through her, hot and blinding, but fear kept her frozen in place. Caleb fought like a man who had already made peace with death. Calm, precise, using the land as if it were an extension of his own body. He dropped low, rolled behind stone, rose again to fire. Each movement deliberate, controlled. One rider fell. Another wheeled his horse, cursing, retreating under fire. When it was over, the silence returned heavier than before, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire and the ragged sound of Mara's breathing. Caleb stood there for a long moment, scanning the horizon until he was sure they were alone, then slowly holstered his gun. Only then did his shoulders sag, just slightly, as if the weight he carried had momentarily shifted. He walked back to the rocks where Mara and the children waited, knelt so he was eye level with them, and spoke softly. "It's done. You're safe." The children clung to him without hesitation, as if they had always known where safety lived. They did not linger. Caleb broke camp quickly, urgency replacing caution, guiding them into the rising light toward land that rolled instead of burned, toward grass that brushed their boots and air that smelled faintly of water and life. By midday, the desert lay behind them like a bad dream, and before them stood a weathered ranch house tucked against low hills, smoke curling from its chimney as if it had been waiting for them all along. Mara's knees gave out when she saw it, not from weakness but from release. She wept then openly, the sound tearing free after weeks of being locked inside her chest. Caleb caught her before she fell, steadying her with a gentleness that broke something open in her all at once. "You're here," he said simply. "That's what matters." Inside the house there was food, real food and clean water, and beds that did not shift beneath the stars. The children ate until they slept where they sat, crumbs on their faces, peace finally softening the lines of their bodies. That night, as Mara lay beneath a quilt that smelled of soap and sun, she felt the baby inside her move strongly, alive and certain. She stared at the low wooden ceiling and understood that survival was no longer just escape, it was belonging. Outside, Caleb stood on the porch, watching the land, guarding a family that was not yet his but already anchored deep in his soul. The desert had tried to claim them. It had failed, and in the quiet after the storm, something new took root, fragile, fierce, and enduring as the land itself. Morning came softly to the ranch, nothing like the brutal dawns of the desert. Sunlight slipped through the small windows in pale ribbons, warming the wooden floors instead of burning skin, and the air carried the low, comforting sounds of life, hens clucking, a distant cow calling, the creak of a windmill turning steady and sure. Mara woke with a start out of habit. Her body braced for panic, but it never came. Instead, she lay still, one hand resting over her belly, listening to her children breathe. They were scattered across the room like fallen leaves, tangled in quilts too big for them, faces flushed with sleep and food and safety. For the first time in weeks, no one was crying. No one was begging for water. The silence was not threatening, it was kind. Tears slid silently into her hair as the weight of it settled in. They had lived. Against hunger, against heat, against men who hunted the weak, they had lived. When she sat up, her joints protested, reminding her that survival always left its mark. But the pain felt earned now, not pointless. She rose slowly and stepped outside, drawn by the sound of an axe striking wood. Caleb stood near the barn, sleeves rolled to his elbows, muscles flexing with each clean swing. He worked like a man trying to outpace his thoughts, splitting logs with controlled force, stacking them neatly as if order itself were a promise. He noticed her only when her shadow crossed the dirt. "Morning," he said, setting the axe aside. His voice was careful, as though he feared startling something fragile. Mara nodded, unsure how to speak to safety without breaking it. "I don't know how to thank you," she said finally. Caleb shook his head once. "You don't," he replied. "You rest, you heal. That's payment enough." He hesitated, then gestured toward the land stretching beyond the fence, rolling pasture, a creek flashing silver in the distance, mountains faint against the sky. "This place isn't much," he added, "but it's quiet, and it's far from the roads men like that use." Mara followed his gaze, imagining her children running instead of stumbling, laughing instead of whispering through cracked lips. The thought scared her almost as much as hope always did. "How long can we stay?" she asked. Caleb met her eyes, steady and unflinching. "As long as you need," he said. And in that moment, Mara understood that the most dangerous thing in the world was no longer the desert, but believing she was finally safe enough to stop running. When the children woke, the ranch filled with cautious wonder. Ruth traced the grain of the table as if it were something rare. The twins chased a
chicken and laughed for the
first time since their father's death, a sound so unexpected that Mara had to turn away, pressing her hand to her mouth to keep from sobbing. Eli watched everything quietly, eyes sharp, measuring the distance between kindness and cost. He followed Caleb through the chores, asked careful questions, learned where the tools were kept and how the fences were mended. Caleb answered without condescension, treating the boy like what he was becoming, rather than what he had lost. By midday, stew simmered on the stove and the house smelled like something close to a future. Yet beneath the warmth, tension lingered, unspoken but real. Mara felt it in the way Caleb checked the horizon too often, in the way his nights were spent on the porch instead of in bed. The danger they'd escaped had not vanished. It had merely fallen behind them, and as the wind shifted and carried distant echoes of the wider world, Mara sensed that the desert had taken its toll, but it had not finished, asking for payment. Chapter 3, Part 2. The sense of peace did not break all at once. It thinned, like fabric worn too often, until the smallest tug threatened to tear it apart. It began with signs so quiet only someone who had lived on the edge of survival would notice them. One evening, Caleb returned later than usual, dust heavier on his boots, his jaw tight in a way that told Mara he had seen something he did not want to name. Another night, the cattle spooked for no clear reason, bunching against the fence with whites showing in their eyes. Mara felt it too, a tightening in the air, the way the wind carried sound farther than it should. She tried to keep the children unaware, kept their days full with chores and small lessons. How to knead dough, how to read the sky for rain, how to listen without fear, but instinct whispered that safety was once again something that had to be defended. When she asked Caleb what was wrong, he gave her half-truths wrapped in calm. "Just passing riders," he said. "Nothing for you to worry about." Yet his rifle stayed closer, and his sleep grew lighter, more restless, as if his dreams refused to release him. The truth came on a quiet afternoon, when Eli failed to return from checking the lower fence line. Mara waited, counting her breaths, telling herself not to borrow trouble. But when the sun slid too low and the boy still hadn't appeared, panic rose sharp and sudden. Caleb saddled his horse without a word and rode hard. Mara standing on the porch, clutching Annie to her chest, her unborn child pressing low as if sharing her fear. Minutes stretched into lifetimes. When they returned, Eli sat stiffly in the saddle behind Caleb, his face pale, eyes fixed on nothing. He did not speak until night fell and the children slept, then finally whispered what he had seen. 3 men riding slow and deliberate near the outer range, marking trees, watching the house, smiling in ways that promised they would be back. They were not drifters. They were hunters. Mara's blood ran cold. She knew that look. She had seen it the day her husband died. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "Men like that never do." Caleb did not argue. He stared into the fire, shadows carving his face into something older, harder. "I crossed them once," he admitted at last. "Years ago. Took something they wanted. They've been circling ever since." Mara looked at him then, not as a savior, not as a stranger, but as a man carrying a storm he had tried to outrun. "You saved us," she said. "But if we're the price, we can't stay." The words tasted like ash, but she meant them. She would not trade her children's lives for comfort, not again. Caleb rose abruptly, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "I won't let them touch you," he said, voice low and fierce. "This land is mine." Mara placed a hand over her belly, grounding herself. "Land can be taken," she replied. "Children can't be replaced." Silence fell heavy between them, thick with unspoken truths and fragile trust. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying distant hoofbeats that might have been real, or might have been memory. Mara realized then that survival had changed shape. It was no longer about walking forward without water. It was about choosing when to stand, when to fight, and when to leave before the cost became too high. And in Caleb's eyes, she saw the same realization dawning, painful, inevitable, and bound to whatever choice came next.